At around midday on the 18th of September 2004, Sulphur Creek grandmother Rhonda Hampson walked over to her friend Leamy's house on Arnold Street in Penguin, Tasmania. She prepared meals for Leamy 5 days a week, and last night's meal was lasagna. So she went to get her dish back and to talk to Leamy about what he wanted for dinner that night. She was also supposed to put on some bets for him. As she got to the house, though, she noticed that the glass in the door had been broken. That's okay, she thought. The winds just slammed it shut overnight. And so she opened the door and she walked into the kitchen, calling out for Leamy as she did so. In the kitchen, she sat for a little while. No answer. From Leamy, from his son Tony. Real strange. And Rhonda, a little worried, and she began to walk down the hallway towards Leamy's room, calling out his and Tony's name. She came to Tony's room, looked in, and was presented with a scene out of a horror movie. Blood, a mess on the bed, blood up the walls. Horrified, she rushed into Lehman's room, finding him naked on the floor, with his head caved in. Lehman had been struck in the head 15 times with a blunt force object. Tony had been struck 72 times. Rhonda screamed. She called the police. Let's take a stab at this. Hi mates, and welcome to Something About Murder. I'm Jay Something, and every week I bring you a case from Australia's true crime history. If this sounds interesting to you, please help us out by shooting the like button with your trusty boomstick, hitting the subscribe button, bit of stabby, and then punching the notification bell in the face to be notified every time we release a new video. All of our episodes are released at the same time in podcast format on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your true crime podcast fix. Also, we now have Something About Murder merchandise, designed by myself as well as Australian artist Redneck Kung Fu. It's just a few things here and there, some t-shirts, but I'll put the link in the description. If you'd like to support our channel by buying me a beer or a coffee, a beer please do so at buymeacoffee.com/jsomething. Takes a lot of time to put together these episodes, and it's much better to have a beer to look forward to after filming. Link is in the description. The Tomahawk murders of Lehman and Tony McHugh devastated the close-knit Tasmanian community of Penguin. Lehman was particularly well known in the area as a great bloke, someone who would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. The violent way that they met their demise was the antithesis of how they lived. Look, this isn't going to be a long tale with secrets and mystery. Look, put simply, it's a double murder, fueled by greed and envy. So let's start with this old fellow, Lehman McHugh. Lehman Joseph McHugh was born in Penguin, Tasmania, on the 24th of October 1919. He was the grandson of one of the earliest settlers in the area, and knew that that came with a sense of purpose and community. He grew up in the farming community of Kamina between Penguin and Rihanna. He was well known in the area. He married early, and by the time of this narrative, his wife had passed away. Lehman was known to his friends as Leamy, and Leamy had a son called Anthony, who went by the name Tony. Done? Easy? Cool. So let's move on to a fella named Darren Stokes. Now, Darren reckoned he was unable to work a regular job. He'd had 2 car crashes. He'd been injured from that. And so that made him think he was unemployable. Or maybe he was just lazy. Anyway, he did nothing in a place called Ulverstone. It's not quite large enough to be a city, but nevertheless, it's Tasmania's biggest town. While sexuality doesn't normally matter in these stories, it does in this. Darren was bisexual. He'd been married with children, but had separated from his wife Liz. And following their separation, Darren had rented out a room in his flat. He'd also been in a casual sexual relationship with a guy called Tony McHugh for about a decade. Tony lived in Ulverstone as well. There was a decent age difference between the two. Let's talk about this. Darren Stokes was 34, whilst Tony McHugh was 62. When Tony's father Lehman became ill, Tony relocated from Ulverston to his father's home in Penguin to care for him. Whilst not on his mind at the time, Leamy's will stated that Tony would inherit the entirety of his father's estate, except for a $5,000 inheritance. So Tony did what all good people should do, and he made a will. Sidebar here, make a will. You don't want your money going to the government. They get enough. Anyway, Tony's will's beneficiaries were a bit of a surprise as well. Darren Stokes had charmed his way into the older man's heart to the point that he was included in Tony McHugh's will. Not just Darren, but also his ex-wife Liz. I guess she knew? Anyway, unfortunately, making his sometime lover a beneficiary and telling him about it was a kindly but ultimately fatal gesture for Tony. Lehman McHugh, like many others, mistrusted banks and the stock market. He belonged to a generation that believed money was safer buried in the backyard or hidden beneath the bed rather than the hands of the wealthy bankers. Look, he's probably right. Rumours circulated in the Penguin community that Lehman had a large sum of money stowed away at his home. Darren Stokes knew of these rumours too. Tony had told him. And so with nothing better to do, Darren Stokes started to obsess about the two sources of McHugh money. His beneficiary status under Tony's will, and old man Lehman's cash, let's call it a cash stash, in his Penguin house. He didn't want to work, and it seems like this money was an easy way of living the high life without having to actually do anything for it. Darren shared his house with Walter Williams for a while, and would regularly attempt to persuade Williams that they should go and get some cash from Lehman McHugh. Walter later said that Darren told him there was between $150,000 and $200,000 at Lehman's house in Penguin, telling him that it was under Mr. McHugh's bed in a suitcase. Darren also said that they would have to be careful because an old lady next door kept an eye on the house, suggesting they go in the front because the old lady kept an eye on the back. Williams, of course, he just said he didn't want anything to do with it, and he soon moved out, and he thought nothing more of it. By September 2004, Stokes and Tony McHugh hadn't met up for around 3 months. For one reason or another, things had cooled off, and Tony McHugh was telling friends he wanted Stokes out of his will. He said he wasn't happy about the will, and he was going to soon change it to make sure Darren didn't get anything. Darren, for his part, was concerned. Aww. He worried that if the old man died, Tony would waste away the McHugh inheritance. And that was his money, rightfully. I mean, not really, but it was in Darren's mind. The McHugh money occupied Stokes' every waking thought. He told many in the small community about the cash stash in the Penguin house, as well as his status as the beneficiary. And after Walter Williams moved out, Darren's sister moved in. Her name was Kylie Stokes, and she brought with her 13-year-old son Corey and her boyfriend, Bradley Lambert. Now Bradley, this dude was a drinker. He was a violent drinker. You know those sorts, they get drunk and then they punch on their women. You know what I mean? Kylie was obviously in fear of him, and there were whispers of domestic violence. If Darren Stokes knew about his sister's suffering, it would be surprising if he didn't. Well, he didn't let it get in the way of a blossoming friendship between him and Bradley Lambert. Of course, Darren broached the subject of, raiding the McHugh house with Lambert. Only he was no longer being coy about the fact that the robbery would be a kill and grab mission. If they bumped off both McHugh men, Lehman's estate would pass to Tony, and then with Tony dead, it would all pass to Darren. Even if they could not find the cash stash in the house and left empty-handed, inheritance laws would soon see it raining cash for Darren Stokes and, by default, Kylie, Corey, and Bradley. Now, initially, Bradley said no, it was a dumb idea. But Darren kept pestering him about it. And so by September, Bradley, Kylie, and Corey were planning a trip to Queensland, and Bradley needed some cash. Bradley told Kylie to let Darren know that if he raised the idea again, this time Bradley might be up for it. Lambert flagged his change of heart with Kylie while they were getting a carton of booze down the street. And when they got home, the boys and Kylie got on the piss, watching the footy on the TV. And by the time they'd nearly finished the slab, of course Darren had started bringing it up again. Bradley said, well, if you want to do it, Daz, let's go and do it, man. Let's go and rob these people of their money. Anyway, look, the chance of one man in a small part of a small island being comfortable with this murder plot would, you'd hope, be slim. But somehow, In Bradley, Darren had found a mate who apparently didn't care about whether they were murdering someone or not. His sister Kylie didn't seem to care either. But Lehman and Tony McHugh were innocent. They'd never done anything to anger Darren. The only thing they'd done to make Darren and now Bradley want to kill them was to have access to a fair chunk of coin. This was just Darren's way of winning the lottery. By this point, it was around 1 a.m, and the two began to plan the attack. Darren, of course, had spent many hours obsessively thinking about his plan and thinking it through. The decision was made, the switch was flicked, and the two McHughes were as good as dead. The plot was discussed openly in front of Darren's sister Kylie and her son Corey. The men didn't bother disguising what the hell they were doing. Anyway, there was some dispute over who did what, but it seems like Bradley Lambert grabbed his Tomahawk with the blue and yellow handle from the backyard, and Darren Stokes pulled a large knife from the knife block in the kitchen. And in the flat, Bradley waved the miniature axe around, as they talked about how he would hit the men if they resisted. Stokes, with his kitchen knife, said he'd finish the job if Lambert couldn't. And so, with that decided, in the early hours of Saturday the 18th of September, the two men drove the 15 minutes or so west from Ulverston across to Penguin. When the killers smashed a window in the front door of the Penguin house, it alerted no one, not even the occupants. Lehman McHugh was deaf, and Tony McHugh routinely took sleeping pills. The two intruders entered, and the dastardly deed was done. Tony was sleeping in his bed when he was first hit with the Tomahawk. He struggled for life after the rude awakening, but Bradley struck him over and over and over and over again. His body later told the tale of how he tried to shield and defend himself with only his arms, as he was struck 72 times with the Tomahawk. Old man Lehman was next. He'd been woken by the noises in the nearby room and had time to get out of bed before the two attackers reached his room. The old man also tried to shield himself with his arms, but he died while being struck 15 times with the Tomahawk. To say the men were butchered would be to sanitize the grim reality. Butchers use sharp implements and they make their slaughter quick. A gun, a knife, or even an axe would have been kinder. But these two old fellows were robbed of even the cold compensation of a relatively fast and painless death. The 84-year-old and 62-year-old defenseless men were left lying dead beside their beds with blood all over their walls. Stokes later claimed Lambert emerged from the bloodbath and said the young one wouldn't fucking die. Look, the two killers had hoped to find a chest or a suitcase, their big old lot of cash, and they thought that they'd have about $200,000. They found nothing. And so they left empty-handed, hiding the kitchen knife in the bush on Arnold Street. Bradley Lambert had blood on him, so they drove back to Ulverston to the home of a cousin of Lambert's, Robbie Bredmore, telling him that Bradley had been bashed in a fight down the street of Ulverston. Bradley asked if he could burn his clothes, telling Robbie that if he got pulled up by the cops, he'd go to jail. Bradley and Darren told Robbie they'd beaten the piss out of their attackers. And so they burnt the clothes, and Darren had a nice cup of tea while Bradley showered, and then all three smoked a couple bowls of weed. And as they drove back to Darren's place, Darren cleaned the Tomahawk and he threw it in the Leven River. Arriving home and tired from their big night out, the two men then went to bed. Rhonda Hampson had been a close friend of 84-year-old Lehman McHugh for 35 years, and a good friend she was too. She visited Leamy every day and often took him to his medical appointments. When Leamy had a hip replacement, she ran a raffle and raised $1,300 for him. She said he was a lovely friend, a real gentleman. On the night of Friday, 17th of September 2004, Rhonda, on her way to work at a nearby hotel, she popped in on Lehman and Tony and left them a lasagna for dinner. She tended to cook for them most nights of the week. At around midday the next day, Rhonda Hampson walked over to Leamy's to get her dish back and to get the info for a few bets that she was to put on for Leamy. And so as she got to the house, she noticed that the glass in the door had been broken. But that's okay, she thought. The wind might have just slammed it shut overnight. She opened the door and walked into the kitchen, calling out for Leamy as she did so. Leamy, Tony, Leamy. And in the kitchen, she sat for a little while. No answer from Leamy or his son Tony. Real strange. Rhonda, a little worried, began to walk down the hallway towards Leamy's room, still calling out his and Tony's name. She came to Tony's room, looked in, and was presented with a scene out of a horror movie. Blood and brain on the beds, blood up the walls. Horrified, she rushed into Lehman's room, finding him naked on the floor, with his head caved in. Both men looked like they had been savaged by a wild animal. She called the police. Penguin's 3,000 friendly, close-knit residents were shocked by the crime. Look, the area had previously only been known for the cute little fairy penguin colonies that dot the island's northern coast. It was a bleak attack. The employment of a Tomahawk to deliver more than 80 violent blows to the victims over the course of a long, unrelenting murder was odd. Residents believed that a psychopathic serial or spree killer was loose in their neighbourhood and was planning to strike their town. In a state still reeling from Martin Bryant's mass murder years before, the prospect was terrifying. Police attending the scene found what Darren and Bradley had not. They found an old metal trunk. A sergeant took it to the Burnie police station, where it was opened in front of other officers and a justice of the peace, and it contained nearly $40,000 in mixed denominations, with a lot of older, grey $100 notes and some old paper notes. As for those two scamps, Darren and Bradley, well, they acted as if nothing had happened, and they went about their normal lives. Stokes was nothing if not daring and devious. He boldly confronted police the day after the murder, stating that he was only trying to feed Tony McHugh's pets. He even went to his victims' double funerals at Penguin, where he blended in with hundreds of genuine mourners. When the local media photographed the throng, they had no idea they were also photographing the killer. Stokes even cleaned out Tony McHugh's place in Ulverstone, selling the furnishings, using the cash to purchase a new ute. While Darren Stokes kept up appearances though, Bradley Lambert and Kylie Stokes took their scheduled holiday to Queensland. Stokes, who was well known to have been one of Tony McHugh's lovers, was interviewed by police on the Tuesday after the murders. Stokes muddied the waters by telling officers that Tony McHugh's other lovers and friends could have been involved in the murders. In a formal declaration to police, he even listed two particular people as prospective suspects. Stokes also provided a stat deck with a false alibi detailing his made-up movements during the relevant times. He and Lambert watched football on the night of the murders and stayed home all night. However, police did not dismiss Stokes as a suspect so simply. The wills provided him with a motive, and his widely publicised plans to rob the McHugh house had reached their ears over the years. On Thursday, he was brought back and interviewed as a suspect under caution. That is the warning: you are not required to say anything. Stokes, on the other hand, did not use this right to remain silent. Instead, when he was questioned about his former flatmate Walter Williams' statements about his plot to rob the McHughs, Stokes simply denied travelling to the McHugh house on the night of the murder. It took days for Tony's friend Stephen Gale to learn of the death of his friend Tony. The weekend after the killings, he visited Darren Stokes. He just blurted out to Darren that Tony was dead, and Darren said, "What?" He said he was surprised to see there was no reaction from Stokes to the news. The next month, police divers found the Tomahawk in the Leven River. Meanwhile, Bradley Lambert and Kylie Stokes were having arguments on their holiday, and returned to Stokes' Ulverstone house. And during a very heated argument, Lambert told Kylie that he had killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. There appears to have been another altercation and some kind of domestic dispute between the two later on that day, and the police were called in. Officers spoke to Kylie right before Christmas 2004, and she gave clues that she could know something about the death of the two McHugh men. She was angry with her boyfriend, and she knew she had a trump card. She laid it all out in the days that followed. Police searched Stokes' residence, armed with a warrant, and detained him in late December 2004. Bradley Lambert was picked up around the same time. Both men's early denials of any involvement buckled quickly, and they each began to race to frame the other as the criminal mastermind, and scrambled retrospectively to put the tomahawk in the other's hand. Stokes went as far as swearing on his children's not yet existent graves that he didn't commit the murders. He said that if he talked, Lambert would have him killed inside prison. Stokes said he stayed outside the McHugh house while Lambert shocked him by going on a killing spree inside. All Stokes had intended was a robbery. This was despite the fact that Stokes was the one who knew the layout of the house, including his lover's bedroom, and supposedly all about the cash stash. Lambert said Stokes planned it all and hit the men with the tomahawk, while Lambert waited outside, and that they swapped clothes afterwards so that he got the bloody ones to sell the right story to his cousin about the fight. Lambert said that Darren had told him that if he said anything to the police about this, Darren promised he'd be looking for Bradley to kill him. As he was being questioned about the killings, Lambert got visibly upset. Asked by police why he was upset, he said he was leaving for the mainland soon and he wouldn't get to see his young relatives for a long time. The police didn't believe him. And Darren Stokes and Bradley Lambert were then each charged with 2 counts of murder. When the trial began, the killer's tall tales continued, albeit in slightly more polished form. Stokes claimed that after making it his life's work to rob the McHughes, he was nonchalant about attending the criminal foray. He didn't even want to be there. Stokes claimed Lambert had originally been going to rob the house on his own, but didn't know where to go. So basically, in the end, he attended as a navigator. He told the jury that he went to the house with Lambert and then waited at the car nearby for him to return with the money. Stokes claimed that he found Lambert covered in blood in the doorway, asked him what he'd done, and that they then left the house. Darren said that after they left the house, Bradley promised to harm Stokes' family if he said anything about the murders. And of course, Bradley claimed he was the one threatened with harm. Having encouraged a robbery with weapons, Kylie Stokes was not the world's most untarnished witness. She was still a devastating one. On the stand, she wept when the Tomahawk was produced. Then she skewered her brother's claims of non-violence, telling the jury that the 2 men had discussed having to kill the old man so that what he had would be left to Tony, and then once Tony was killed, Darren would get everything. Darren Stokes hit back from the stand, saying it was Kylie who had suggested offing the men, and that she had somehow gotten away with murder. Young 13-year-old Corey Stokes, Darren's nephew and Kylie's son, gave evidence that his uncle had raised the murder plot, saying that Darren said that they should kill them and get the money, and that they would have to kill them and get in quick and quiet. Between witness evidence, weapon and wound evidence, terrible suspect interviews, it was a near-perfect prosecution case. The physical evidence itself prevented claims about accidental death, it locked in intent to kill, and made impossible any arguments against it being murder. Look, in the police interviews earlier, Stokes' own version had gone from "I didn't go anywhere that night" to "I didn't think Lambert would do what he did, but I didn't go inside" to "I left the house and I went outside after seeing blood on Lambert." He took the stand in his trial to give his own evidence. You could almost hear the cogs turning as Stokes, the terrible liar, tried to match wits with the prosecutor. Lambert's evidence wasn't much better, but at least he didn't take the stand during the trial. He mostly kept his mouth shut during the entire event. Any decent lawyers would have told the 2 defendants that their case was terrible, urged them to plead, show remorse, and scratch some years of freedom back from what would still be a hefty sentence. But no, these 2 Einsteins chose not to apologise, not to admit the murders, but to fight the charges. Darren, in particular, seemed to believe that his scam of killing 2 old people to have the whole estate passed to him was so transcendentally clever that it would somehow protect him from conviction over the burglary killings. During summing up, the 2 men's lawyers tried to paint the bloodbath as a botched robbery, not a planned double killing. The jury took 4 hours to untangle the web of lies, cruelty, and betrayal, and unanimously they found Darren Stokes and Bradley Lambert guilty as charged. When it came to sentencing, the extreme nature of the crime saw both men get some of the severest sentences ever dished out in Tasmania. Stokes and Lambert each received 42 years in jail with a 28-year minimum stretch. There was little reaction to the guilty verdicts from the killers or their relatives, who had sat through every day of the trial. Only Australia's worst spree killer, Martin Bryant, who gunned down 35 people at Port Arthur and got life without parole, and serial killer Jamie John Curtis had been set longer non-parole periods in Tasmania. The judge described the crime as horrific, some of the worst crime he'd ever seen, and it was a terrifying ordeal for both victims, not to mention the impact on the local community. Both Stokes and Lambert later attempted to appeal their convictions, to no avail. They were both granted leave to appeal, but their appeal failed, and with their judicial avenues exhausted, both men now have to live with the punishment that they have received for taking the lives of Lehman and Tony McHugh. Bradley Lambert and Darren Stokes will both be eligible for parole in 2032. Every year, on the 18th of September, Rhonda Hampson places a memorial for Lehman and his son Tony. She maintains that as long as she is alive, she'll make sure there are fresh flowers on the graves of her old friend and his son. 2 men tragically taken from this earth for no reason other than existing with more money than another man that they knew. Thanks for your time today. I really appreciate you watching the whole video. Join me next time as we trawl through another episode in the true crime history of Australia. If you've enjoyed this video, once again, please go ahead and shoot the like button with your trusty boomstick. Go all stabby stabs on that subscribe button. And make sure you punch the notification bell in the face so that you can get notified every time we release a new video. In all seriousness, it really does help us out with the YouTube algorithm and all of that sort of stuff. And remember, all of our episodes are released at the same time on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from. If you'd like to support the channel, please head to buymeacoffee.com/jsomething. Buy me a beer. I'm on Instagram at Something About Murder, and I respond to every message I receive. So I hope to hear from you, and I hope you don't get murdered. Stay safe out there.